lavale Aeda ja Tadashi. Now I switch to English. We will start. Can we get new slide, please? Thank you. We will start with a panel discussion. Outlook for solidarity in Estonia, the legacy of communism and its impact. Tadeusz and Aet will do a short presentation, and after that we will have a discussion. Okay. And I encourage you to also, as Mairi said, write down your thoughts, your questions. I will give you opportunities to share them. So we will not do it only in the end, but also if you have something to say or you want to share, you can show with your hand, and I will see it, and at some point I will also take those here. We will have 2 mics, so yes. And we are ready to start. Hello.
Hi.
First of all, before your presentations, please give us a short introduction of yourself, who you are, why you are, what you do. And maybe Tadeusz, you want to start.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tadeusz Zdzierski, and I'm originally from Slovakia, but currently I live in the Czech Republic. I'm an environmentalist by education, and as I was kind of trying to study the root causes of the environmental crisis, I started to study economy, which is how I got to degrowth, which has been pretty much the center focus of my last work within 5-6 years. And I work in an NGO, in an organization where we try to raise awareness around degrowth, kind of debunk the myths about economic growth in the Czech Republic. And we also do a lot of educational programs, whether for high schools, sometimes universities, but especially kind of like extracurricular, non-formal, like summer schools, Degrowth Academy. So kind of maybe for people like you who are not going to go back to university and still want to know what's wrong with the economy, how could it look differently, and how do we achieve it? So I guess that's where I put most of my time currently.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm Aet Tännist, and I am an anthropologist. I have also a background in sociology, so it's a long sort of journey because of Estonian educational system and anthropology not being available at the time that I was studying. But it's been probably the most formative thing for me to become an anthropologist and to be able to actually see how people live in their own villages and groups. And my PhD research took place in sort of post-socialist kolkhozes and sovkhozes, the kind of little villages that were created around those. And that was something that showed me how people fared after the collapse of the Soviet system, but also how from that period, how people started to try to rebuild their lives and what's been happening since then. But for myself, that sort of interest in the kind of communal life and the social realities of people post-collapse was at the same time parallel with my interest in climate crisis since the kind of mid-90s. But I never studied it, and it was only in the kind of mid-2010s where I sort of decided that actually it makes sense to study this as well as a social scientist. So since then I've been looking primarily at the groups that are preparing for collapse. So before I was looking at the kind of post-collapse situations, now I'm looking at people who are anticipating collapse. So these would be climate protesters, people prepping for the future that they are feeling that might be coming. So that's been my main focus since my PhD. Well, not my PhD, but since about 15 probably.
Thank you. And now I give
Oh, yeah.
this.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a discussion about slides, and Tadeusz was very keen on slides, so I decided last night, which was to the detriment of the numbers of hours that I slept. Where do I see it? Yeah, but
you
actually,
can also see them there.
oh, okay. I don't, because I don't have my glasses on. But it is primarily a mnemonic device, so forgive us both for our slides. It's for a reason. And I kind of fiddled a little bit with the title because I thought the kind of idea of commoning might be something that might be worth bringing up here. Is it not coming? I don't think it's.
Isn't it?
No, se pole prilli
The
tässä.
one underneath.
Ah, läks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is this the first one? Right. So, okay, let's do it that way. So, whenever there is a crisis or a collapse, it's not a sort of singular entity. It's not a singular moment in time. It's usually something which is rooted in a much longer period. And when we think of the period in the 90s and maybe the very early sort of moments of what we could easily call collapse, because it was an actual collapse of a social system, we definitely have to remind ourselves that it is something which was built on the previous period. And the previous period, which is the late socialism, was one long crisis in many ways. I mean, it was a system that didn't work in many ways. I mean, it did work for some people, and it definitely had plenty of functioning aspects to it, but at the same time, it was often failing. It's okay, actually, I can see. Oops, now it's changing around. Oops.
It's okay now.
Yeah. So for the people who were living through those years, and we have to say even today, probably the diminishing majority is in some ways familiar with the socialist era and has had some exposure to this experience of living within socialist system, even if they were children. So this kind of a reality, this kind of a crisis was a known entity, was something that wasn't in itself daily a shocking thing. So people were living with this sort of daily little crises, and in order to cope with these, with the shortages and with the failures of the services and so on, they created these little ways of coping. And this included skills and tools for coping. Let's say skills of mending, skills of repairing, but probably more crucially, it included skills of relying on others. So in many ways, it was pooling the skills. It was the ability of learning from others how to, mend something that's broken down, to make it last, because you wouldn't be able to get it from the shops. But also to overcome such, let's say, an interesting little example. So such moments where you just didn't have certain services available at all. So this example I would like to bring is actually on the picture on the left, upper left corner, and it's reminding those of us who might remember this of these kind of little bathing visits. So during the sort of 80s, in some regions in Tallinn, for instance, you didn't have warm water all the time. So what people did was that they visited their relatives or friends, and it was a nice visit, it was a social event, but it was at the same time also functional because people went and had a shower or went to the bath or whatever. So it was this kind of social relations that were built around shortages and around this crisis. So in some ways we could say that we came out of that system relatively well prepared for the crisis to be coming. And I would like to label this, I would like to put this little word there, that we were experiencing a crisis which was common. It was shared. We all went through this together. Now, come on. Oui. Yeah, I know.
Keskmine.
I don't know why this is...
Keskmine, vaata, sa pead keskmist.
Yeah, I know, but... Okei, teeme nii, väga hea, aitäh. Et siis võib edasi vajutada, ma ei tea, miks ta mul ei tule. So, and then from that background, we came to the collapse of socialism. But we were not properly prepared for that. We went through the period of collapse itself relatively well, but what we weren't prepared for was what was coming after. So post-collapse crisis was a different kind of a crisis than the previous one. Just to list very quickly what was happening, on the one hand, it was shock therapy. It wasn't a slow change, it was a very sudden change. We experienced privatization, loss of employment for many people, especially in the countryside, the collapse of the structures of employment was particularly stark there. And that led to stratification, people finding themselves in new positions vis-à-vis others. And that also meant partly loss of social space in the kind of practical and physical sense, in that there weren't necessarily culture houses available anymore and these other kinds of spaces where people would come together. But it also meant that people didn't want to come together, but because suddenly they felt that they were not in the same positions as before, and it was quite painful to explain this. This was all happening in this kind of media and discursive reality where people's failures, people's losses were explained as their personal failure, not the structural failure. And that led to what I have called dispossession. I mean, this is a kind of nice Marxist term, but it's been used a lot in social sciences to explain how people experienced considerable changes and how they lost something to the benefit of somebody else. And in the countryside in particular, we could see symbolic dispossession. The Estonian rural people were very much kind of seen to be at the forefront of economy, and even in comparison with the other Soviet republics, Estonia was seen as this very successful Soviet republic. That symbolic position was lost over the 90s, and suddenly the rural inhabitants found themselves in this sort of symbolically very negative position. And it was also social dispossession, as in people lost their relations with others. They couldn't rely on others anymore for a variety of reasons, one of which I already mentioned, that people didn't feel comfortable anymore at each other's company, but also they lost mutuality, so mutual relations were eroded by these inequalities that had suddenly emerged. So for instance, when before you would be able to have equal relations over, let's say, birthday presents, I give you something and you give me something more or less comparable in return at some point, or you bring people to visit yourself, visit your home, and you feel comfortable in sharing everything because you know that it's more or less the same. And suddenly all of that was lost, and people didn't really know where they are positioned. So it was all sort of eroding this mutuality. And it also led to the exodus from the countryside and from the country. We had migration, especially since 2004, shooting up. And as I mentioned, it was sort of blamed on the victims. So if we try to capture this in some way, we could call this a process of uncommoning of the crisis. So suddenly it was sort of everybody's own little personal crisis rather than something which is shared and understood similarly. So I don't know if you could go to the next one. And there's this nice little expression by a very interesting Latin American thinker, González de la Roca, which is that we're experiencing some poverty of resources. There is no resources. When poor people often are seen to have resources to overcome their poverty, in this kind of neoliberal reality that Estonians found themselves, they were experiencing poverty of resources. The solutions they had for any of the issues were all on the grid. They couldn't step out of the grid. They had to find financial resources rather than social resources. It was always dependent on the availability on the market and them being able to participate in that market. The solutions were individualist, and there was this inability to create social solutions because of these eroded mutualities. Kas sa saad edasi keerata? And I just wanted, because it's such a characteristic example, I just wanted to show this picture because this is a classic example of individualization of solutions. So this is in the middle of the most slippery period in the Estonian winter, and rather than having a nicely sanded area in front of these houses, somebody has had a little bit of sand and they've created this personal little ribbon, if you can see in the middle, to safely get to the shop, which is just around over there. So it was a very peculiar period post-collapse. This is now early 2000s that this picture is from. And for many people, there was actually no need to create these crisis commons because they didn't, at some point, didn't go through crises anymore. They weren't in the middle of a crisis. They had found solutions. They had not failed as these others who were blamed in their failures. Right, let's go forward. And it also meant a certain poverty of vision. So this current system, the capitalism that we had finally arrived to, was seen as absolutely the most superior. And there was, or there still is, a very clear lack of critique. The threshold of capitalism doing something so bad that Estonians would be willing to criticize this is very high. And this picture is just another sort of cartoonist trying to depict the stupidity of some people thinking that socialism is something that could be a solution. I'm not suggesting that the sort of Soviet solution was a solution, but it's a classic example of how one of the ways that could be thought about, or some aspects could be thought about, is sort of rejected outright. And of course, the capitalist system is tightly connected to these other ideas, such as other values, such as freedom and independence. And if you're saying no to capitalism, you must be saying no to all of these other values. So this logic is there very clearly. And there's two very interesting Romanian anthropologists, Kelcea and Druta, who have used this term zombie socialism. There's this socialism is this term that is always conjured up whenever anybody tries to say that, well, maybe there are issues with capitalism, maybe that some of these sort of common and shared aspects of even the socialist system are actually to be considered as valid, as potential, with potential. And it's immediately, if you say something like that, there is an immediate sort of link to, you just want to bring the Soviet Union back. I think most of us have experienced this who have had any conversations on the ground. Can we go forward? Yeah, I think that was just. So despite this lack of critique and lack of vision, there are some groups who do put this forward, and we are sharing the space at the moment. And I would call these sort of prefigurative groups. These are people who are trying to prefigure the future, trying to think how can the future of the capitalist system, inevitably also in crisis at some point. It has been already in crisis. It's in the crisis in some ways all the time for some people, and it's probably bringing on another crisis in the near future. So these prefigurative groups are, on the one hand, anticipating another societal collapse, and they're trying to learn various kinds of skills and techniques to be prepared for this. They are changing relations between, people, and in some ways they're trying to recommon these realities. They're trying to think about also self-care. They're trying to think about empathy. Sometimes they fail. I mean, these groups inevitably are still filled with humans, and humans are prone to failure. And they are trying to prevent the worst to come, which means that they're trying to prevent it also socially, which means that they're trying to build relations with everyone already now, build relations between groups as well, these sort of little groups, and just a little sort of list of groups, alternative groups, alternative approaches. As I say in the beginning, it's rare. But and they sort of function in the niches and periphery of the society, but there are already emerging the various kinds of guerrilla gardens. There are protest groups which are also thinking of alternatives. There are various kinds of repair shops. I don't know why I'm repeating figurative groups, but I guess you can, put anything else under this. And there is this sort of desire amongst many of those groups to recreate their relations with the nature. And one of those, I think, most fruitful or interesting ones is those trying to put the human back to the position that it might have had at some point in the past as a keystone species. According to some research, Amazon rainforest is actually created by humans who have been sort of foraging and roaming that territory and leaving various kinds of seeds everywhere, which has sort of put the base down for that kind of future reality. And there is this effort to common in an emancipatory way. Sorry, this is just too early to say. And that means basically that not only are we trying to create these sort of shared groups, but we are trying to do this in a way which is taking into consideration the issues in the past that living in communities might have had, starting from oppression of certain groups or individuals or individual preferences. Estonians can think of libahundi Tiina, but I'm guessing in every society there is some sort of experience of community being an oppressive reality. So we don't need to create another community space which is oppressive. And the last slide. So just to remind us that there are limits to recommoning, there are limits to solidarity. Unfortunately, these tend to be these sort of groups that we are seeing emerging, tend to be quite exclusive. I mean, you just need to look around here. I think we're all fairly similar in many ways. And there are very few bridges that we are able to lay down for the marginalized people. And we're not inviting them into these spaces, but we should be thinking about that. One of the reasons is that if you don't, if you don't need other reasons, then a practical reason is that if you don't bring people to on board with your plans and ideals, they will start at some point to work against you. Also, in Estonia, we don't really even define what's poverty. Anybody who doesn't have certain things is seen as poor and labeled negatively, stigmatized in ways which is very problematic in Estonia. But actually, we need to discuss what is poverty, and maybe some of these definitions are problematic, and maybe some of the activities or realities of people that we might be seeing as poverty is something else, it's actually sufficiency. And also, it all has led to us being unable to reach across political divides as well. I mean, there's this sort of ECRE group, or I don't know, maybe there are some new groups in Estonia which are seen politically as problematic. So when we do move towards solidarity, we need to take all these aspects into consideration. And the commons that we are forging today need to kind of appreciate and invite also the skills of the people who are often living already in this crisis, which is primarily these sort of left behind, dispossessed groups, for instance, in the countryside. They have incredible skills in many ways, which we could learn from and also make them feel that their skills are valuable. And sort of they are living in this sort of collapse that we are maybe anticipating, and living perhaps in fairly comfortable ways, unless we label them as not living in a comfortable way. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there, and maybe we come back to some of these aspects, and I hand over to you, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't sleep, but he caught some flu, so...
I woke up in the morning, with this flu. Is it okay if I stand? Because I'm used to standing when I present, my slides, okay, perfect. So I guess what I would like to share in my dedicated time a little bit is the experience of us trying to do this work around degrowth in the Czech Republic. As I guess, for example, we had a conference like this with 2 people for 4 days in 2022. We started working on degrowth more around 2021. And there has been a lot of evolution in terms of how we think about this. So I'll try to bring in a bit of the specificity to maybe Kallis's talk yesterday and also yesterday's movie to the region of the semi-periphery of globalized capitalism, kind of, which I think is very specific. And ourselves in the Czech Republic often fall into the trap of just copying Western strategies that don't really work in our contexts. Let's see if this works. Point towards you, okay. No, it doesn't. Can you also just do the work for me? Okay. Yes, cool. So I'd like to divide my talk into these 2 parts. One are kind of the consequences that I would call cultural and psychological of the previous regime. And then the second part will be more structural and political economic. And I would like to focus more on the latter, as I think also what you have summed up, I think brings a lot of also specific Estonian context to how things went here, which I don't have such a big knowledge of, but I'll bring some context from the Czech Republic. So yeah, I was this environmentalist who found out about the fact that growth is that thing that is destroying the planet, it's creating a massive inequality in society, and I was like, why are we not talking about this, right? Which was one of the motivations why we started the degrowth team, because this topic has been even in Czech academia for more than a decade, and yet there was no discussion on this in the public, almost no discussion on within the climate movement. We're like, okay, let's do this. We'll give the information to the people, and they'll be like, whoa, we need to change the economic system. My experience from this is actually pretty interesting, and I think it taught me a lot about capitalism, essentially. So the first thing that you see over here was an interview done with me with one of the most quality and sort of trusted liberal media in the Czech Republic. They made an interview with me on degrowth, where I'm saying that growth cannot be green. Growth is creating lots of inequality. It's not going to save poverty globally nor nationally. And I was like, cool, I'm so happy that it's in, it wasn't a leftist media. It was proper liberal sort of. I was like, this is a big entry. Somebody on Twitter, somebody who studied at Oxford before, obviously had nothing to do with economy, sustainability or something, said that I'm a liar, that I'm a flat earth person, and he put graphs completely picked out of context or disinterpreted in his Twitter thread, and said that this is a really kind of shitty media, that they are publishing an interview with me. It got a lot of traction, and a lot of people were complaining. And so based on that, they re-edited the interview. And after the things that I'm saying when I'm saying growth cannot be green, they would put things into brackets like, the data shows otherwise. Growth doesn't reduce inequality, inequality is being decreased. And they would put the data that this person put in his Twitter thread. And I wrote them what the hell? You didn't even inform me about this. You didn't ask about the data I'm coming from. Can you please take this away? Because literally thousands of people are reading this, and it's probably their first entry with the degrowth movement, right? They didn't do anything for a day or two. when I started also the Twitter war, and I put a Twitter thread saying what happened, and put all the data and peer-reviewed academic studies that are kind of like confirming my point of view, based on which they deleted the whole article. Not too long later, I went into this another liberal, like pretty famous, and also a lot of people think it's like good quality journalism. And they were interested in degrowth. They sent me the questions, and the first question that they asked me before even like saying what is degrowth, any context, which like 99% of the people in the Czech Republic, maybe a little bit less now, like don't have. They're asking me if I am a communist and if I want to repeat the previous regime. And the whole 50 minutes of this interview were like trying to make me into a communist in a way, in such an obvious way that even people who really like this media and weren't like leftist or anti-capitalist were saying that this was really not like professional. Obviously, the interview ended with, where are we getting money as an NGO? You know, where are we getting money that in a way we're spreading anti-capitalist propaganda for EU or Czech money, you know, which is one of the ways to really discredit people in the Czech Republic, that NGOs are kind of like a scapegoat. I don't know how is it in Estonia. So this was my kind of entry into liberal media with really like scientific-based analysis that's being discussed elsewhere, but obviously in our context, it has very different connotations, but also it's very easily mobilized against you to discredit you like very, very easily. And then this is another liberal media, and the headline here is translated over here, right? So growth, 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 that's the only way to stop global warming. Anyone who says otherwise wants to take away our freedom. This is like the main economics media journal, kind of. And so what I want to say by these things, that obviously in our countries, the capitalist hegemony is so entrenched that if you go against it, you will always feel a massive backlash. And I think regardless of what words you use or what discourse is, etc., like if you really want to talk about the important things, there will always be this sentiment. And what we know from Czech Republic, and there have been studies like this, that we call it like primitive anti-communism. So it's kind of like if you label anybody communist, you just like delegitimize, discredit them, debate is over, and it's being used by politicians, it's being used by liberals. It basically, what it does in practice is that very much limits your maneuvering space of discussion, but also of policy that would be more kind of like pro-social. What are some other psychological, I think, like repercussions or consequences of the previous regime in our context is this like hyper-individualism, where people, as you said, maybe don't want to comment that much and want to have their own private thing. For example, Czech Republic is one of the countries with higher concentration of like private pools on their gardens. Like everybody needs to have their own. And there's this like mutual distrust, obviously with collectivism and with all these like things that we envision in the degrowth future, like cooperatives, for instance, because if you want to do something with others, everybody is going to discourage you from doing that. Like we were about to buy a house, like 8 of us, and everybody around me was just, are you completely nuts? Like this can never work. Like why would you ever? You cannot even do entrepreneurship with your family, not even with like strangers, you know? Like just such a big distrust in doing things together. That a lot of the alternatives that we talk about within the degrowth movement or literature are just like, cannot be thought of because it can never work. Here, just for the sake of clarity, I try to, or usually how I defend this position, why we're not communists, is to say, and here I try to put some of the main like differences that, first of all, like communism or the previous regime was a productivist regime, right? It tried to overcompete with capitalism in terms of who is able better to achieve growth. So that's the first difference. It wasn't about like redefining good life or anything like that. Second of all, obviously the previous regime was authoritarian, whereas degrowth wants more democracy. And second of all, and I think this is what people don't realize often, and I think it's the strongest argument that we have, is that in both of these regimes, both capitalism and the Soviet regime, the decisions on what to produce were still concentrated in very minority of people, kind of like a tiny elite, right? So in capitalism, it's mostly owners of big capital, of big corporations. It's the shareholders, asset managers, et cetera, et cetera. In communism, it was the ruling party, right? We couldn't talk about like democracy, people deciding what to produce, what do we need for our good lives. Like that's not what was happening. So I think this is where you get people thinking like, okay, there's actually quite a lot of similarities between the two systems, and degrowth really should be like an anti-productivist, anti-growth, and mostly also expanding the realm of democracy into the economy, not shrinking it, because what I say is that we are not living in democracy in capitalism. I don't know how is it in your country, but in Czech Republic with massive inequality, most of the media is being owned by the kind of like oligarchs, and most of the capital is like international, so we don't have much control over it. So there is actually, if we are speaking only about political democracy, it's very, very limited unless we're actually able to have economic democracy. Anyway, so these were just more like some points of clarification and a little bit of our experience discursively in the realm of Czech Republic, where we have also realized like, oh, if we want a degrowth revolution or evolution, whatever we want to call it, there is no infrastructure for us to like be properly heard or present our points of view to the masses, because most of the people who own the media have a high stake at discrediting us, delegitimizing us. So these channels cannot really be used for that kind of purpose. And here I get to the more structural debate, which I think is actually much more interesting, and for me was very revelatory when I came across it. And that is to look at capitalism not as a system within Estonia or in Czech Republic and like kind of new here. It's a global system. It has developed historically, and as Jason Hickel was saying in yesterday's movie, it cannot function without its outsides that it extracts from, right? What we have within this world system is some kind of capitalist cores, which you can imagine as the high-income countries in the West. Yesterday we heard a lot about Finland, so Finland would be one of the countries that we would consider to be in the capitalist core. Then there's the semi-periphery, which is countries like us, which are not like exporting the primary resources most of the time, but we're somewhere in the middle of the value chains. And then there's the countries of the global south, right? Which primarily are here for the capitalists as a source of cheap labor resources, with not a lot of like legal protections, et cetera, et cetera. So what is really fundamental about this is, first of all, that there's an illusion of this universalized middle class that we all dream of, especially in the post-communist context, right? As you were saying yesterday, we were looking at Finland saying like, oh, how good could life be? But in a way, those dreams are just about like coming from semi-periphery to the core, something that we call the developmentalist illusion. Because in a way, this world system, you rarely ever get from one position to another. Historically, very few countries, it's like Southeastern Asia, that made it from the semi-periphery to the core. Or like, there's very few changes within how this economy is structured. And by us, in a way, only trying to get to the West, first of all, it doesn't work when we copy the Western strategies. Second of all, it doesn't radically alter this unequal development of the world. And it also, I think, if we are looking at it in this way, we see ourselves in the Eastern Europe as backwards, not good enough. Our democracies are not good enough, right? all this stuff, and we would look to the community gardens in Berlin as like the cool, hip sustainability thing, but we don't see the dachas here or all the provisioning that happens as a non-formal economy because that's not cool. So it's this like, literally we've been colonized even in our imaginaries by the West, wanting to be like the West and not seeing actually the traditions and practices that we have that are much more oftentimes sustainable than the Western ones. One of the academics in the Czech Republic, Petr Jehlička, told me that he was in a research project which looked at all these countries like Denmark, Norway, Germany, like these are the sustainability pioneers. And then he was like, well, but when you look at their material footprint, these are the countries that are the most polluting. They are the ones consuming the most. Why are we looking at them as the sustainability pioneers? It's obviously about what you're looking at. If it's like environmental policy, also how much is being externalized by their way of life, et cetera, et cetera. But in a way, what I wanted to say about the developmentalist illusion that going there is not possible, and oftentimes it also actually prevents us from applying strategies which would be much more useful for our context to get into this, like whether we become also even more exploiting the South, right? Because now we're exploited by the West, we're the colonies of the West, but then we're also exploiting the global South. So we have a little bit of a difficult position to like navigate also discursively. What I also want to say though is that because of these changes, and I really, if you're interested in this context of semi-periphery, I really recommend you to read Agnes Gaj, who is a world systems theorist and activist, and is really, for me, changed the way how I look at my own country on the semi-periphery, more with pride or historical understanding, rather than like, oh, we're so backwards, we're 20 years behind the West, you know? They're only 20 years up front because they're exploiting us and exploiting the countries of the global South. What is one of the consequences is this, I would call the NGOization of society, where basically we are cherishing this like civil society, you know, human rights, et cetera, all these discourses. Maybe we talk about gender, environmentalism, and all this stuff, but in a way what happens in the context of semi-periphery is that our countries tend to be very polarized and unequal. Whether you look at Estonia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, now also when the global capitalism stops growing so fast, these inequalities are even more severe because we're like a frontier to exploit for them in a way, to cheapen our labor in all sorts of ways. However, this NGOization of society is oftentimes thinking about these liberal Western values, but forgets about the people who don't actually think that they made much progress. It's these forgotten people. In the Czech Republic, it's around 30% of the people who think that they were better off in the previous regime, right? And this is people we don't usually talk about. This is the people we complain about, voting for the far right. And these are people who don't feel represented by our middle-class politics, by our environmental problems of climate change when they struggle to make it to the end of the month, while we struggle with the end of the world, you know, kind of like. So I think this is one of our bias, maybe of most of us here, being from this middle-class background, including me. And what I want to talk about is a little bit how I think in order to come to degrowth society, we really need to overcome it. Because growth has become like a discursive and ideological weapon to stop this class conflict that's at the heart of capitalism. What it promises you is that everybody can be better off. We need no conflict. We need no redistribution. We will just grow the economy and all of us will be good, right? This is what happened in the 60s, 70s. With even the invention of the indicator, GDP. And it really, you can see this quote from like US Governor of Federal Reserve Bank. Growth replaces income equality. As long as growth exists, there is hope, and that makes large income differences bearable. So for example, the CEO of Amazon is earning 6,500 times more than median worker in Amazon. It's as if you were working from like Stone Age to today to earn the same amount of money that this guy does in a year. and you would have to save up all that money in those 6,500 years. You couldn't spend anything. But you have hope, because we don't need to go into class conflict, because growth is lift all boats, right? So yeah, this is just the meme. I really like memes, because this is how we're told it works. Like, when the richest get even richer, we're all good, because it will trickle down. All of us will benefit, and yeah, this is what we see happening. And the levels of inequality are obviously like bigger and bigger by year. Why am I talking about this? Is that I think it has big repercussions for degrowth, where oftentimes this middle-class politics presents itself as one of these three categories. One would be like that we are the communicators of science. I remember when I was at university and I started doing these massive screenings for 200 people about how consumption is bad, and my theory of change was that once people start knowing, things will change, And it's the same in degrowth debates, like decoupling. Growth cannot be dematerialized. So once I tell this to policymakers, and this is the other category, then I'm expecting things to change, right? Because we think we're rational beings, and once we have the data, etc. Then there's the policy technocrats. So like, oh, people are poor? Okay, I will write a report on a policy which can solve this poverty, right? Like, I have a really good policy, and also in degrowth circles, in my 5 years when I go to international conferences, it's a lot of talk about policies, maximum income, jobs guarantee, credit guidance, all of this stuff. Very little talk about politics of how do we put them in place? How do we get the power to put these things in place when it's in most of the degrowth policies are going against the material interests of the ruling classes, materially speaking. Almost all of them, right? So this thing about well-being economy or reimagining good lives and finding discourses that are very non-controversial, I think are playing its role and are important, but they are not the whole story. We need to connect to a vision of a good life, but we need to build up power. And we cannot think that if we come up with a better discourse, the economy will change. That's not how it's going to work. And then the third category is left radicals, so these people who know about capitalism, know that that's the root cause, but then their way of fighting it is to get a veggie box from a farmer or buy organic matcha latte, in a Berlin coffee places. All of these strategies are essentially discursive, identitarian, but don't really build the power that we need in order to actually put forward degrowth in its full form, and even in the tiniest forms, because almost all of the policies depend on this, literally. And so also what is, I think, the most, dangerous is that if we use only these discursive strategies around climate change, we will really alienate the working class people who are fed to the far right. And also, what maybe we didn't talk about yesterday was that then if you even have green policies, and you cannot really put green social just policies because this goes against the material interests of the ruling class, you have green capitalist policies like Green New Deal, which people resist all over Europe, not only because they're uneducated, but because actually they're materially worse off after it's being implemented in many places, right? Because it's a policy package that has been so diluted by the capitalists that it serves mostly them, not really the people who feel like this is their way to a good life. Because we don't have enough power to put forward Green Deal that would be socially just. So we are fine with diluted versions, but then these diluted, non-just versions are just polarizing society and blocking the green agenda for the years to come, I think. So in a way, what we need is to really kind of come to terms with the fact that if we want to go into post-growth society, whether we're a post-communist country or in the capitalist court, it really means to wrestle with the material interests. But I think Obviously, it's a bit more challenging for us because I think our countries are oftentimes like conflict averse because we feel like we made it to the Western world and now the job is done. But then we see that for a big part of the society in semi-periphery, this is not the case. So just very quickly, this labor organizer, Janie McElvey, is speaking about like 3 possible theories of change. And one is like advocacy, then there is mobilization and organizing. And I want to strengthen the 3rd pillar, but shortly talk about the first 2 because of their underlying logic of building power or changing the world. The first one is advocacy. So you have this theory of power or even practice where you have these NGOs, good lobbyists who make interpersonal relationships with the politicians, and they want to put forward a certain policy that would benefit us, right? It's a very much kind of like an elite way of doing change, meaning that you actually don't really need even the poor people that you want to help. You don't really need them because you have a good expertise, you have the data, and you have all these relationships to lobby for them or make some kind of campaigns. You can put forward certain policies, but you don't change the underlying power dynamics of the society. Then there is mobilization, which I was very involved in, hello Czech Republic, where you meet these 100 people on the streets to protest for some cause, whether that's Palestine or whether that's climate change. Maximum, you have 200 people that go and block a coal mine, right? Most of this is just like very discursive practices that, and in a way, I don't want to say that advocacy and mobilization, that either of these are bad. All of them play an important role. It's just that neither of the 2 are changing the underlying power structure of the society, essentially. Because mobilization, usually it's the people, you put up a Facebook event to come to demonstration. The people who are interested come. And so you're always in the same circles. You're also a small country. We're a bit bigger country, but it's the same. You know all the leftists from the protests. These crowds don't really change. They don't really grow, right? So it's very limited as a long-term strategy to build up social power. And then there's the third, and mostly also what happens, even if you have a massive protest in the streets, what happens the next day? Like, usually the politicians don't change very much. Like, it's written about in the media, but we have, like, it's not like a power leverage for them to actually change, and then you have no real structures built. These people came to a one-off event, but then they're kind of gone. You feel maybe a sense of accomplishment for a while, then you feel kind of empty. But yeah, and then there is organizing, which is kind of based on the fact that you really need to organize working class or like people diverse from you. You need to go to where they're at. You cannot wait that they will come up because you put up a Facebook event. So you do door-to-door campaigns, or you talk to them in their workplaces. You're in the streets talking to them, and then you try to create structures that then can infiltrate into in the long term. So, for example, tenant unions in the Czech Republic, like that's one of the new forms of organizing that's there because the housing crisis in Czech Republic is one of the worst in Europe. But unless you have this people power, you're not going to get very far. Because if you, for example, do it in the workplaces, then you can really leverage power with the threat of a strike, which historically speaking has been one of the most profound ways of not being in the protest on a Friday afternoon, but actually having key sectors of the economy saying like, no, if you don't do anything around climate change, we will strike. And this is obviously not something that environmentalists have used a lot because we usually tend to look at the workers from the dirty sectors as somebody not to ally with, right? But that's where the power lays, essentially. What I want to now show is some of the examples from Czech Republic that I think moved us much further away from the strategy of discursive building awareness around degrowth to actually thinking on material plane, how do we change this system? And they usually don't come from the capitalist core, interestingly enough, because it's been countries of the global south and on the semi-peripheries that have struggled with the systems the most and needed to find ways to meet their needs. And didn't have that much resources as Berliners for this kind of stuff, which on their unemployment leave, they're earning more than I am for a full-time work in Czech Republic. And then we were like, oh, the Western movements are so good. Well, yeah, because there is so much resources for them to function the way they do. So there's, for example of Kerala in India, which is a southern state, super leftist. They have very strong unions and very strong cooperative economy. So kind of even when, and the fact that this two combination, it's very important, because if you were in cooperatives, but you were surrounded by capitalists who can really cheapen labor, you wouldn't really be competitive as a cooperative in the market, right? Because if you pay decent living wage to your workers, and the capitalists who don't, like, you're not competitive. So it's only when unions are strong that also cooperatives can be strong, because unions bring the higher value of labor, kind of. So super strong. It's one of I think they say that for 1/5 of GDP, they meet similar life criteria as, or like standards of quality of life as they do in the US, like similar life expectancy, education, gender equality, massive gender equality in India. It's something that they look at a lot and work with. Then there is FUCVAM, which is kind of like this housing cooperative in Uruguay, which essentially has this like federation where it's like thousands of people living in this cooperative housing units, you know, which they have been building from like the 70s. Then there is example of Preston in the United Kingdom, which you might think like, oh, it's the core United Kingdom, but then it's a very deindustrialized area. So it's like the periphery of UK, and I guess in Estonia you have your own peripheries, where basically they were deindustrialized, and what they do is this strategy, and I invite you to look it up. It's called community wealth building, where what they're trying to do is to really map where does the capital outflow from our communities, right? What are all the international corporations or firms that we don't have local alternatives for? So for example, then they use so-called anchor institutions such as hospitals, universities, you know, these like bigger institutions, and they channel their public procurement towards local cooperatives, and they have a very thought-through strategy of how to start and expand the cooperative economy of the region in the sectors where it's needed to store the value in the region, rather than just being used as a colony again to extract from. I cannot go more into depth, but it's super interesting. And then there's Solidarity Economy Center in Budapest, which tries to do similar thing, and that is to connect unions with cooperatives. So kind of what they do. And when I mean cooperatives, it's a big difference if you do cooperative, like organic veggies for the middle class who wants to, you know, be the solution. And it's very different if you're trying to build models that work for the working class people, you know, which is essentially what they're trying to do, to like connect, for example, union organizations to local food provisioning and come up with systems that's not super expensive or super inaccessible because of time, et cetera, et cetera. So they're trying to come up with pilots in terms of housing, energy, food, like cooperative pilots that then are used in connection with unions. And why it's important is because then you're not telling to people like, do co-ops because it's the anti-capitalist or progressive thing to do, but do co-ops because materially you'll be better off. Like these prices are lower because there's nobody extracting value from this. So you're making case for these alternatives, but on a material ground. And if you cannot make it on a material ground, then you have to innovate further to make it viable for the working class communities, kind of. And I have a last slide. Oh yes, so this was just that now in the Czech Republic, the pillar of our strategy that like long-term strategy that we want to be building on is that we really need to like expand the cooperative economy massively in the Czech Republic, which is not easy. When you say družstvo, most of the people associated with communism, right? Which wasn't the most democratic form of economy, as we talked about before. But we need to like rehabilitate this tradition rather than only discursively think about like changing the names, you know, or post-growth entrepreneurship. I think that's cool for some people as well. Like we can use different discourses, but I think there is no way around rehabilitating some of our like past further than the Soviet regime, because the cooperative economy was very democratic and strong before the authoritarian regime. And then there's unions. We were talking about it yesterday. The unionization in Estonia is very small. Czech Republic is no better. Unions are oftentimes not doing the most progressive or radical things, but it's also because people maybe like you here don't join these institutions, because you think that it's not really for you or it's being looked down upon. But unless we join these institutions and change them also from within, we won't be able to achieve much, because the labor power is one of the biggest powers against capital. Unless we organize on these grounds, I don't think we will have any post-growth revolution, because as has been said yesterday, like the gem making is not gonna deliver for the class struggle. And last slide, here are some examples from the Czech Republic. I don't want you to think that we're super far into this. Like this strategy, when we met with Agnes, who is doing this world systems theory and stuff, we were like mesmerized by her knowledge, by her analysis of the semi-periphery. So this is kind of like a new strategy, but it has been put into place in some past years. So for example, there is like now progressive union organizers who are using this like more union as a social power rather than as a service, to really go around and organize new people into unions with clear strategies and methods that have proven successful in the past and are usually not used in the traditional unions anymore. So there is a new union in social care, for example. There is the initiative, Iniciativa nájemníků a nájemnic in Czech, but it's kind of like if you're kind of renting your apartment and you're dealing with really shitty landlords, usually there's nobody to help you. So landlords can even get a lot of money off you that it's like illegal, but you're not going to put them into court if you have no money and time for this kind of stuff, right? So you need a collective mechanism of how to fight this. Then there is the summer school for unions, which happened this summer. There is a new wave of housing cooperatives, so young people who cannot afford their own flats and don't want to be paying to the landlords are usually buying some bigger sites more in the countryside to also connect to those kind of people, but also just to afford housing, because we could never, even if there was like 20 of us there, we could never like buy a house in the city center of Prague or something else. And then there's the new IT cooperative, Druid, which also for the middle class IT people, when they discovered that actually you could not be working for some international corporation, but you could be working in a cooperative where you decide collectively where the surplus goes. And for example, their surplus, their profit oftentimes goes to support these movements back, then I think a lot of people are like, now one of the alums of the degrowth summer school like left his IT job and wants to do something similar or join something similar. So yeah, I think that was the last slide, is it? Oh no, I definitely overdid it with the slides. But last thing is that, because in a way what I want to say is that degrowth is not the framework that's going to get you great friends in the working class communities, right? So you might be thinking like, is this question or frame, etc., still relevant in our post-communist context? And I think it is, because, or from my experience, but also I have a bias of being the degrowth person in the Czech Republic, I think we're fulfilling an important role of debunking these myths around economic growth in public discourse, which people who are going to do cooperatives won't put a lot of energy into doing this kind of work, and it's still important to like change our imaginary, public imaginary. Now, for example, even the president candidates were asked the question about degrowth, and I think that's big, because then at least growth is not something that we just implicitly always accept and take as given. Then there's the opening up space for radical anti-capitalist discussions. I mean, 5 years ago, I was afraid to say the word capitalism in a public, because there is so much self-censorship, right? You might be, and I see a lot of people nodding. Well, if we cannot talk about capitalism, how the hell do we get out of it? So I do think that we need to normalize these kind of debates. You have mentioned that there is like a lack of critique, and I think while this might be alienating to some people and some middle-class people mostly, because it's the system that relatively works for them, for a lot of people, this is the debates that they want to be having and that actually are attracting a lot of people. And I think degrowth allows like a platform or a framework where to have these debates, where to have conferences where we don't need to be like, oh, I don't want to say that word, And also, yeah, I really think that because of the analysis and we didn't get that much of it here, like how is capitalism connected to patriarchy and like devaluing gendered labor, care work, et cetera, or some of you were at the workshop. But I think through this critical analysis of capitalism, we can actually, if we understand it properly, we can really connect environmentalists, labor unions, feminists, you know, many different groups, and I think that what degrowth in a way does, if it's really like a political slogan and not a lifestyle movement, you know, because we've had movements of voluntary simplicity and minimalism before, but I think degrowth is something different. And I also think that it's a framing that has the potential to radicalize middle classes, maybe people like you here, because if we want to, make it through, then I think we need everyone to join the struggle, and middle classes are important part of it, not to only enjoy our privileges, but connect with the people who are kind of like marginalized the most in the system. Yes, thanks a lot, and sorry, I definitely overdid it.
Thank you. I will ask first from public if someone has any questions or comments after. Yeah, and here. Is there someone who wants, because we don't have too much time, if you have immediately to say something, then... a moment, microphone, because otherwise it won't be heard.
Thank you really very much. It much resonated with our discussions yesterday. Several times it came out to rehabilitate, say, Yeoman, Onu Eino, how would you translate, Uncle Eino, who is in Estonian media ridiculed. He drinks vodka, not wine, like middle class, and talks not
non-PC.
Yeah, and he has bad manners in relation to women. In this, he says directly, not like courtois.
I don't understand.
Politely.
Courtship manners aren't that good, but actually he's repairing your bicycle and car and house and so on. So honor this Yeoman. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, I will ask you later on also, so if you have something, just remember it. And now I will ask you, Aart. We were talking yesterday that you have also this UK experience, and would you like to share that also a little bit, if that is very different or not at all?
I did actually bring this in already at the end of the talk, which was primarily sort of focusing on these different groups that are already organizing, that are already trying to move towards this sort of new world that they are imagining. And this one aspect of prefiguration is not just imagining what's coming, but trying to already live this now.
Exactly.
So there is a lot of that. Preston is a perfect example of prefiguration actually leading to a real outcome, a real outcome of living in a way that we are imagining the future, the future world to perhaps get past all these crises the best. And aside those very successful examples, there's a lot of effort to organize, to create groups. I am primarily focusing on climate groups, Extinction Rebellion, Christian Climate Action, and many of those are not just protest groups, but they are also making an effort to create communities. Often that's dependent on space. And of course, UK has even worse prices issue for land and any property for communities to acquire, so that's a real kind of problem. But slowly, especially recently, there is more and more green councillors in local councils, which means that they are helpful in acquiring some sort of rented space, and that can be the seed that we need. I mean, there are some examples in Estonia and Türi. There was this, Kokukonna, I can't remember. Yeah, it's got some nice name, which Konnamaja, that's right, yeah. So there are examples here too, and these could be expanded, and this space is hugely important because, I mean, it's all really nice and good to have WhatsApp chats, and I mean, the amount of different forms on which I participate in these chats is immense, and it sort of feels like my life is filled with learning about all these new initiatives. Life Houses is in one of those really interesting movements. There's a book, I can't remember the author's name, but Life Houses, if you look it up, you probably come across that, which is trying to lay out this sort of pathway to this sort of community building. And protests are not just, I mean, useful for protesting, and Estonia is in that sense a really sad case because we kind of, after the 80s, early 90s, we kind of decided, well, we've done all the protesting, let's just stop now. And now that's been primarily picked up by those people who are really kind of pushed to the edge, which is the sort of, I suppose, working classes, but people who we probably identify most with EKRE and see them as kind of just politically untouchable almost. But protests are the ground on which we can start building communities. If we have this sort of shared feeling of anger towards some issue which is enough for pushing us out to the street and organizing this sort of real, again, physical space, because, I mean, it's our bodies that are present when there is a protest. So when we bring our bodies to say something in a protest, that also lays the ground for community building. So I think that's massively important to try to regenerate in Estonia. I mean, there was a couple of days back, maybe even yesterday, there was a protest, I think, kind of genocide-related protest somewhere in Tallinn, I think. I think there was a good 20 people or something like that, which is like 350 people signed a protest letter. Was I there? No, I wasn't. I mean, I have to admit I was somewhere else, but everybody has that excuse, you know. That's why we're not there when it's needed. But anyway, so protests, all of these struggles are immensely important, and UK is a good example of how this is creating that ground and hopefully that sort of fertile soil for change.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add, Tadeusz, on that?
Not really.
I think Tadeusz was speaking about that. You know, that was a huge list of stuff.
Few questions before. I'm very anxious about that clock today. Aha, yes, very good.
No.
No, it's not. No, it's also for,
okay.
Yeah.
I would like to touch on a hard topic of security and current securitization in context of war in Ukraine, etc., but also the context that one of the strategies has been noted for foreign interference in the form of including taking efforts or making efforts to destabilize societies. So any sort of protest, any sort of open opposition is met with a suspicion of security threat or security concern, and also immediate question, oh, is this really part of the democratic and local movement, or is it somehow stimulated or founded from abroad? So what are your thoughts on this topic and how to handle it? And I know it's a big question, because it's a huge threat to democratic participation.
Absolutely, yeah. No,
Thank you.
So it's another question, no? I completely agree. Interestingly, this is not in Estonia, at least the climate protests and protests that would come from that kind of ground are not usually seen suspiciously. Whereas the protests against, for instance, the windmills or whatnot, all sort of anti-green protests are often seen in these terms, and that's also problematic. I mean, this is not something that we should celebrate. I think one of the main ways of what we have just talked about, contributing into changing this, is that these would be sort of genuine conversations within the groups themselves. And also we need to invade or capture these other protests, which in some ways are against what we see as valuable, such as sort of green direction, and have these conversations within these groups, which would ensure that you wouldn't have somebody coming from dubious other groups or trying to capture these groups in turn. So I think maybe by making this a real shared space, this would help a little. This would make it less likely. This would also direct people's conversations in a way which would explain why it wouldn't. Because I think some of the people in those protests, windmill protests, for instance, do increasingly feel so alienated from Estonia, for instance, that they really do sort of genuinely say, well, actually, even Russia would be better in these circumstances. So having these conversations, bringing in different views from our mindset as well, hopefully could. But in order to do that, we need to actually create relations with these people, and I don't think we're very good at that yet, but we have to think about it. But I wonder if you have similar experiences in Czech Republic or Slovakia.
I think I wouldn't have many things to add, to what you have just said. I think, as I want to say, for me, the experience is that the media landscape is so owned by oligarchs that in a way you, first of all, need to be really rooted in these communities and connected them in order for them to know what's really up, not how are things being delegitimized by mainstream, oftentimes even really liberal media. And second of all, I think we need to create, if really that's the thing, that it's being delegitimized, then I think a big part of it is also just creating the even media infrastructure for more, I don't know what the media landscape looks like here, but I have, for example, comparison from Slovakia and Czech Republic. In the Czech Republic, there's at least some good quality, leftist media that's more with the people, not with corporate interests. In Slovakia, there is none. And that's really, even for, I think it's mostly middle classes reading this leftist media, but they're at least their interests and needs of people that you don't really meet often spoken about, which in Slovakia, it really doesn't happen. I have no idea of a lot of things which investigative journalists have done in the Czech Republic, like leftist journalists, the working class poverty issues like this. These are not being talked in the Slovakian mainstream because there is no media that would put these topics forward, who would think that these are the key topics to talk about, So I think that's a big part of what also needs to happen, but that on its own is not gonna make it not necessary for us to connect to the people protesting or, So creating relations with people who are not like us is, I think, absolutely essential.
But if I may add also, I do think that we all have the voice. We can all participate and explain, and many of us. Estonia is such a small country. Many of us have names and are known, and we need to go out there more and put ourselves out there. I've been publishing since I was articles in the media since I was in the first year of university, and it's actually doable. It's not. You don't need to be a journalist. You don't need to know how to write too well. There will be an editor helping you, but put yourself out there more. Then there is clear that there is quite a mass of people actually that you can't just take this one person down. You have to take a lot of people down who are saying the same thing. So media is still a chance in some ways.
Yeah.
To comment on something that you said previously. You said about the protest regarding genocide, it was only 20 people. And
maybe I was wrong, sorry. I just saw the picture,
that's
which
what
looked like
I wanted to give a little hope for the people, because I think that the protest culture in Estonia is
not dead at all, because the 20 people yesterday, I was among them, was organized within like 4 hours maybe. It was an immediate call. It was not organized with police or anything. And to the protest that is going to actually happen on 11th of October to protest genocide, we are expecting at least 300 people.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And I intend to be there, hopefully, and hopefully more of you come. We're here now.
Thank you. Yeah, mikrofon sinna. Hey.
Thank you for a very, very interesting and I would say entirely confirming within my sort of existing, pre-existing belief system presentation. So that always feels nice, doesn't it?
That's not great. I think you want to change people.
Exactly. But my question is, do you feel like this process of decolonizing yourself is it a necessary and or sufficient sort of, I don't know, not a preamble, but a necessary step for movements such as these as well? Or is there space for essentially continuing within these, I don't know, colonial epistemologies within these movements, is my question.
Discussed that yesterday, didn't we?
I think it's super, I mean, essentially from, for example, systems thinking, like one of the deepest leverage points for systems change is changing the mental models. So how I think about things, right? If we're looking at Finland as the thing that we want to become as a country, it's going to influence what kind of political paths we take in our personal lives also, right? So I think working on this level of changing our minds and undoing the heritage of capitalism, colonialism, etc., that we have internalized is, I think, a big part of it. What I also want to say, though, that I think within movements, I don't know, again, how it looks like here, but from my experience, there's this Puritanist then ideal that we will be all great, that there will be no sexism, racism, da-da-da-da-da in our communities. And if there is, then these people are canceled. Mm-hmm. And that's not how you build power. So I think I fundamentally agree that we need to do massive shift in terms of how we relate with each other. Like, I have focused this talk on this more structural, critique and stuff. But what we do a lot of work on, for example, Degrowth Summer School, is to, really name and connect to the ways that the system lives within us, in ways which we reproduce it, and give concrete tools to get out of these patterns of relating to one another. Like, for example, in movements, I feel so many, like, typical, I also do work around, like, masculinity, right? So there's oftentimes men in movements which are taking up too much space, for instance. So everybody's complaining, but it's very rarely that somebody tells them or tells them in a way that is caring and that doesn't shut them down and go into shame. And if you are in shame, well, you don't want to be part of that crowd. You also don't want to be part of that crowd if you come to a movement that does like hand gestures and uses language that you've never seen or used, and it's not being introduced to you properly. So I think I'm really worried, and I'm interested in this a lot. Like, for example, for me, nonviolent communication and its more political approaches that consider power inequality and stuff like this are super powerful ways that I've been trying to like change my own ways of relating to myself and to others with. And I think it's an immense amount of work that we need to do in social movements. So we would really create environments that are like joy to be in, that if there is a conflict, if somebody does something bad, we have ways how we hold these people with care. We don't just let it go, let it pass. We don't not talk about problematic things that happen, but we don't shut down people. And I think this culture is just not there in most of places. So oftentimes, for example, we want to be these friends of everyone and we avoid conflict. So we don't give each other we don't give each other difficult feedback, for instance, and then it creates problems later on. So I think there is an immense amount of work we need to do on the internal ways of functioning in order to create structures that are like regenerative, restorative, and essentially transformative for the people within them. for example, one of the things is this like burnout culture that, right? That's one of the things, like we were talking about overstepping the limits of our planet. And then as activists, we overstep our own limits individually, we burn out, and the continuation of people leaving the movements, coming new people, almost like a resource to do the thing for activism, burnout, we leave them somewhere like, what the hell, you know? This is not something we can afford, and we need to think about, like, really think deeply about how do we prevent ourselves from overcoming our limits. And I'm not the one to preach. Like, but I'm working in an organization which never appreciates people overstretching their boundaries, for instance. Nobody's going to be like, oh, it's great that you saved us, or like, you know, you have a task and nobody says, I'm going to do it, and then the person who always raises their hand after 1 minute raises their hand, and you're like, oh, cool, this work is going to be done, right? So toxic. Because this person is going to burn out soon, you will lose a key member, they will fuck up their mental health, like, so I think there is so much work that we need to focus on internally as well. And build expertise and competence in these changes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much. I would take only one short question or comment, and then I have to let us all go because of the time pressure. Very, very sorry to finish that. Very interesting. So, is there someone who is really burning to ask something, or just say something, to share something? Yes, please do.
I am Taylor from Degrowth Estonia and also Democracy Innovator. It's not working.
It is working.
It is.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. And Tadeusz, really nice to appreciate what we have from our culture and from our past. Like, this is very empowering, because we have a lot in Estonia as well. What we're struggling is zombie communism, yes, and you called it something else also. But anyway, this you're being so ideological when we talk about the alternatives. Oh, and also from media side, it's like, oh, we don't cover ideological stuff. But what is that they cover now, right? So how to kind of explain, it's not a question, it's just like, you know, sharing my problem. Our ideology is equality of people, democracy, you know, well-being of nature. So how, and we all share that actually, like, so how can we create that or turn that into, that's our shared ideology. And I don't like the word ideology at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe instead of ideology, which has a load, it's just political. I mean, all of these things are political. It's about taking power away from where it is at the moment, and in that sense, it's a political act. I feel the same, that ideological is perhaps a problematic word, and we have to be quite aware that we are trying to find what isn't clearly labelable as a particular ideology. And I mean, of this list that you gave, in particular, the relationship or the care for the nature is, I mean, how can you possibly say that it's ideological? I mean, this is fundamental. I mean, there's just nothing ideological about this. And when we are trying to advocate for this change, unfortunately, we have to be quite conscious of not being ideological. For instance, when we teach or when we create materials, we need to be, we need to step back and be as factual and fundamental as possible. So I think it is something that we need to keep in mind. So yeah, it is important.
I think, or should I still respond? No. Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you were going to stop me. I think we also need to do a better job of showing how the current ideology works. We were talking about this yesterday. I think it's so interesting in education. Now there's a lot of debates, and before I was more working with non-formal and formal educators, that all of these things we talk about, most of the teachers are afraid to bring them up in schools because schooling should be neutral, right? Well, what we call neutral or non-ideological is what supports status quo and capitalist hegemony at the end of the day. So unless we change this assumption, for example, about education, that there is such a thing as neutral or apolitical education, there is no education that's apolitical, none. And if you want to know more, read Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Like, it's more about like, are we aware of our ideology, and are we transparent about ideology? And as an educator, for instance, like, do I talk about it? Because there is like empirics, right, and stuff like this, but I can also share my relationship with this kind of empirics, the assumptions, like it's a lot about systems thinking, critical thinking, to allow people to see the assumptions of things we say. That's what we, for example, in our NGO call like transformative education, that it's not about teaching people that like renewables are good. Like it's a good piece of information, but we need to go further and really challenge the narrative that we've been fed and socialized into most of our lives if we want to make it into the post-growth world. So, for example, a deep layer of assumption would be that people are selfish, rational, the homo economicus, for those of you who know this term, which is fundamentally, our institutions are built on this. Our businesses are built on this assumption. Our schools are built on this assumption. And I think unless we, for example, change this assumption, we're not going to get far. If we think that there is nothing else but growth, that's again an assumption, right? And mostly people aren't learned, taught to think about assumptions behind things that are being said. And I think that's how you reveal the ideology. So in a way, what I'm saying, it's not only about a specific piece of information, like growth is bad, but it's about acquiring a skill of seeing what's behind the statements that are being said. And I think this, for example, because I know there's a lot of educators here, and I think this is the fundamental piece that education needs to do, and it's difficult to do in other contexts, like on Instagram with 1-minute reels, which are super informative, oftentimes more than lectures, but like don't develop deeper ways of like meta thinking that I think we're all capable of. We aren't just like let to do that because it would be a weapon used against the status quo.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, Aet and Tadeusz. And see you later. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ärge siis unustage check-out'i teha, kellel vaja on. Ja siis 15 minutit pärast algavad töötoad.